have with us for our panel today, Dana Bourland, who is the Vice President of the Environment Program at the JPB Foundation in New York City. Dana works at the intersection of systems related to health, poverty, and the environment. She led the creation of the Environment Program at JPB with a focus on transitioning to a just and clean energy future, increasing access to green infrastructure, detoxifying the built and natural environments, and strengthening the field of environmental justice. JPB is interesting because it combines health and environment funding in a way that you don't see in many foundations. Our second speaker today is Lois DeBacker. Lois is the Managing Director of the Environment Program at the Kresge Foundation. She's been helping communities build resilience in the face of climate change since she joined the foundation in 2008. Her experience also includes more than 16 years at the C.S. Mott Foundation and 10 years in Michigan state government in both policy development and program management capacities. She holds a master's degree in public affairs from Princeton University. And Laura Martinez Pepin, I'm going to pronounce this badly, I apologize in advance, Pepin Lehalleur, who is the Director of Water Programs for the Gonzalo Río Arronte Foundation in Mexico. One of the most important philanthropic programs focusing on water in Mexico, in which she sees a significant opportunity to weigh in on initiatives that promote solutions for a better use and stewardship of water resources, I think in both rural and urban areas. Previously, she served on the National Commission of Protected Areas in Mexico. So with no further ado, let's get underway with our speakers. I believe Dana is first. And if you have questions or comments, please enter them in the chat. We'll do a facilitated discussion at the end. Thanks.
Terrific. Can you hear me? I'm looking at Dominique for a thumbs up. Okay, great. Terrific. Let me just put this in slide view. Are you seeing my screen with slides?
We are, yeah.
Terrific, okay. Great, I'm not sure if that's working.
It's still just in presenter view, but we can see it.
Oh, okay. All right, let me, there we go, maybe.
Now we're seeing your note view at the very top left.
Oh.
You switch. It's okay. Switch top left. I think it's the switch the presenter and the.
There you go.
Yes. Oh, good. Sorry. Navigating this, as everyone knows. Okay. Well, terrific. So I'm Vice President of the JPB Foundation. Super excited to have been invited. I don't get the opportunity to talk about our work much, so it's been a great exercise working closely with our Senior Program Officer for Green Infrastructure at JPB, Jennifer Patrick, who helped me get prepared. And JPB strives to empower those living in poverty to enrich and sustain our environment and enable pioneering medical research. And I had the great fortune of being part of the team that launched the foundation 8 years ago and led the creation of our environment program, which I continue to lead with a terrific team, as you can see here, of just amazing social change agents. So starting with initial research 8 years ago to assess the field of environmental philanthropy and enviro and socioeconomic conditions in our country, we set out to close the gap between funding that goes to the large environmental groups and that funding that goes to community-based grassroots groups. And we wanted to target our funds to address areas of the country long overlooked by environmental philanthropy. So our goal for the program is to enable resilient communities by enriching and supporting the environment in low-income communities and communities of color, because the environment sizably and measurably impacts human health and natural systems well-being. Because I know we have scientists and researchers, I can see some of you I recognize in the audience, I will share that we define a resilient community as one that has robust, essential community resources and can identify and mobilize those resources to prepare, adapt, and transform in response to multiple external and internal disturbances and stresses while maintaining those essential function, advancing its quality of life. So our definition of a resilient community goes beyond the capacity of a community to return to the equilibrium after a disturbance or disaster. And actually, it goes well beyond that. We know that low-income communities where we are targeting our resources are facing long-standing inequities, disproportionate challenges, and structural racism. And we're all watching these challenges intensify with breathtaking speed and severity. But we're missing the mark. And that's really what I want to leave you with today. If that's all I say, all that you hear, we need to do more. The time of us. We're not meeting this moment. We need. Living in resilient communities and people who are not is expanding exponentially. And really here, I'm talking about people on the ground that I've met who are experiencing asthma attacks of their children in the night, sealing off windows and doors so that the toxic chemicals from the refinery plant that illegally was zoned to be there don't seep into their homes, crowding into whatever dry spaces could be found when it rains, and looking for shade and respite when temperatures become unbearable, or as we're seeking motel rooms when the forest fires break through those forests. They best know what they need and how to deliver the resources to address these massive and increasingly severe problems. So what are we learning about the connection between urban green space, equity, and climate resilience? I'll tell you what we're not learning. We're not learning that these things are connected, because we knew that. That's why we started the environment program at JPB to start with. And you all know it too. As scientists and researchers working on the environment, you understand how ecosystems work. So I'll pose 3 of our learnings, which include: we must close the gap between who is benefiting from access to basic human rights and those who are not is exponentially expanding. We need everyone engaged, doing everything we can to close that gap. And we must take our cues from our work in service of the frontline communities bearing the burden of these broken systems. So second, I would say we must change the way we work. Confronting intersecting crises presents us this great opportunity to reimagine how we're working within our own institutions and across systems, building relationships and investing in new and diverse partnerships and networks to meet this moment. And we must move with intention and urgency. As I said, as those of you who were with us this morning, Representative Holland said, we only have one Earth and all of our lives depend on its health. So a few words on those learnings and how they translate into grant-making decisions. First, closing the gap. Now that most of the world has experienced the connectedness of urban green space, equity, and climate resilience, because we're living through this global pandemic, but as we took our knee off Mother Nature during the initial months and witnessed air quality improvements, we then saw the stranglehold that our racist structures and systems still has on Native people, Blacks, and people of color. And when you overlay maps showing which communities were historically redlined and denied home ownership in healthy communities, and present day maps of where COVID deaths were highest and are highest, and now where eviction rates are highest, there's vast overlap. Without a national vaccine to prevent the spread of COVID, for many, nature has provided respite, but not for all of us. Access to nature, internet, clean air, clean water, electricity, housing are basic human rights, and they must be available to us all. And so research has shown that parks serving majority low-income households are, on average, 4 times smaller and 4 times more crowded than parks in majority high-income households. We also know that disparities in park access can be linked to obesity and affect longevity and mental health. So our challenge, well, I should say, because we support the Trust for Public Land and their 10-minute walk campaign, on average, about 55% of Americans have easy access to a local park within a 10-minute walk of home. But 100 million residents in the largest US cities lack a park within a 10-minute walk from home. And in cities like DC, that number jumps to 98%, but in low access cities like Charlotte, North Carolina, and in Indianapolis, access plummets to less than 40%. So our challenge is to ensure everyone, no matter the color of our skin or physical capabilities or gender or income, has equitable access to nature, and that we use nature, or we use the renewable resources that nature provides to help us transition to a clean energy future powered by the wind, the sun, and water, and beneficial to us all. If we fail to make this transition, we will see continued devastation and loss that will impact us all, but will disproportionately harm those who had the least to do with causing the problem and who currently live in the least resilient communities. This matters for all of us on this planet, on this symposium, because we're connected. We're all learning that firsthand through COVID. So to close this gap, if I go back to my learnings, we need research that is based in how communities function. And the slide up now just references some of the work that I will note in my following remarks. So for example, we're funding an environmental health fellowship program that invests in junior faculty whose research is focused on and in vulnerable communities. And they are interested in how both environmental and social factors may combine to influence health. They're building a new community of practice at the intersection of the social determinants of health and the environmental determinants of health to close these disparities at the root of what causes them. And we may have a fellow on the symposium here with us. I'm not sure if Ellison Carter at Colorado State Fort Collins has joined us, but she is one of JPB's newest environmental health fellows. So much of our work stems from research that often leads us as grant makers to fund what researchers tell us is best practice. To change systems or approaches, our approaches will be flawed if we're not rooted in that research that is driven by the communities we're seeking to change, that the communities tell us is best practice. Our research institutions often drive scientists into silos, into labs, not communities, and that must change. We're also funding organizations like Groundwork USA to truly examine the connections between systemic redlining, urban heat, and health outcomes through its Groundwork's Climate Safe Neighborhoods. And we're also helping to close the gap regarding who has control over land. One of the many ways we're doing this is by stemming the loss of African-American owned forests due to past discrimination where Black landowners were just not allowed access to the legal system that would provide proper documentation for these owners to pass down land in ways that white owners could. So this brings me to our second learning, changing the way we work. As a new environmental grant maker supporting over 100 organizations every year within the United States, we know that we cannot enrich and sustain the environment without also enriching and sustaining the organizations on the front lines of environmental organizations working on just and equitable solutions. We are resourcing vehicles and organizations to get financial, human, social, natural capital to the grassroots, not in a piecemeal way, but in a way that builds their collective power to influence local conditions in our national programs and policies. So basically, we're resourcing relationships. We're resourcing partnerships based on equity and in the pursuit of justice. And I'd love to talk about more about this in the questions and answers later. By working together and having a reason to get to know one another, then relationships are formed. And this really is the secret sauce to the effectiveness of the work over long-term sustainability. And along with my colleague panelist, the Kresge Foundation, we support the Institute for Sustainable Communities, Partnership for Resilient Communities. The partnership works to transform the national urban climate resilience field by increasing the number of leaders of color in the urban field of practice, advancing approaches that build the resilience of people and places through influence building, community education, engagement, and the installation of clean energy and green infrastructure. And another example of building relationships can be found in the Conservation Fund's Parks with Purpose program, which it works with some of our most vulnerable urban communities through equitable park development projects and a community-centered approach. The Conservation Fund works with residents to transform and restore underinvested in properties into vibrant new parks. And not only do these green spaces provide safe places for kids to play and neighbors to gather, but they also reduce stormwater flooding impacts, and they provide opportunities to train and employ residents, as well as providing access to healthy and fresh foods. But most importantly, I think here is that these parks are planned, developed, and constructed by the community residents for the community residents. And we have to recognize that the conditions of these places that became dilapidated and obsolete is no fault at all to the residents. These are the results of our systems that structurally marginalize communities of color and low-income people. So changing the way we work applies not only to projects that we're doing, but it also, and the grassroots groups we want to support, but it also applies to these long-standing conservation organizations that you think may have it all figured out. But I actually think maybe because they have such a history of doing this work, they may have the longest road ahead in terms of the change that we need to see in them. We do support groups like the Nature Conservancy and Trust for Public Land, as I mentioned. And with them, we try to use our leverage as a funder to challenge the organization's internal status quo. As I mentioned, we support the Trust for Public Land's 10-Minute Walk campaign, and we're funding these organizations to build new skills in cities across the country, to increase equitable access to green space, to hire community members to lead the work, to use nature to combat climate change and build more resilient communities in places where it's needed most. But the bulk of the work that we support is resulting in internal cultural change within those organizations. The third learning, really, that I'll end with, it is the rallying cry of our youth who are calling on us to work with greater intentionality in ways that demonstrate that we understand our lives and their futures depend on it. The problems in front of us are gigantic, but we don't have the luxury of time to work in our own bubbles, on our own projects, in our own departments that are not actively engaged in restructuring ways that aren't just less harmful, but that are regenerative and just. I think I butchered that sentence that I have in front of me, so I'm going to try again because I think it's so important that the problems we recognize are huge, but we don't have the luxury of time to work in our own bubbles and our own institutions that are not actively engaged in restructuring our ways to be not just less harmful, but regenerative and just. And so we'll continue at JPB to bend our philanthropic resources to the grassroots, to build relationships, to invest in people, while we find times to foster relationships across the environmental movement. And we'll continue to challenge ourselves to really reimagine what is possible. And so I'll just end by saying that this work really does require new thinking, new partnerships, new structures, new research to both prepare for an increasingly changing world and respond to entrenched systemic inequities. It requires discomfort. It requires challenging our own views on what's working and what's not. And it requires far more than we are doing right now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dana. That's great. And really interesting. I know there are details, so many details to the way you work. So it was nice to see it kind of simplified into that presentation, and really helpful to hear sort of your approach. Lois, I believe you're next. Great. Wonderful. Hi.
Hi, happy to be with you all. I'm sorry I was unable to join you earlier today, but I'm glad to be here. And I will now share my screen also. It's always interesting to hear Dana. Dana and I did not compare notes, but you'll hear a lot that resonates with what she said in the remarks that I choose to share. I want to begin with just a very, very brief background about the Kresge Foundation. Kresge is a national philanthropic foundation based in metropolitan Detroit, whose purpose is to advance opportunities for people with low incomes in American cities. We provide grants and social investments in support of that goal. We also use our convening power and communication resources to advance social change. We have 8 topically focused programs and practices, and the environment program is focused on helping cities combat and adapt to climate change while advancing racial and economic equity. I find it helpful when talking about equity to define terms, and so I wanted to spend just a minute on that. When I look for definitions, I tend to go to PolicyLink and Race Forward, both of which are nonprofits focused on racial justice. And PolicyLink defines equity as just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. And Race Forward describes equity as meaning fairness and justice. It's focused on outcomes that are most appropriate for a given group, recognizing different challenges, needs, and histories. It's really important to understand that equity is not equality, and equity is not treating everyone the same. It recognizes the different needs of different people, and advancing equity requires proactive steps to create and sustain racial justice. And racial justice, as Race Forward defines it, is the systematic fair treatment of people of all races, resulting in equitable opportunities and outcomes for all. It's not just the absence of discrimination and inequities, but it includes the presence of deliberate systems and supports to proactively achieve equity. Beth asked me to talk about what Kresge has learned from working at the intersection of climate change and equity. And to do that, I just want to give a little bit of background about the evolution of our program as an environmental funder. I was hired by Kresge to design its first environment program in 2008, focused on climate change. My colleagues and I developed what I think was a really solid traditional environmental grant-making program focused on both mitigation and adaptation. And it included support for experimentation in particular places and also for policy reform. So while we were implementing that strategy, however, the foundation as a whole clarified that its purpose going forward would be to advance opportunity for low-income people in American cities. And that clear focus on cities and on opportunity led the environment program to revisit its priorities. We had begun using the term climate resilience to talk about the importance of both pursuing mitigation and adaptation, because if you don't do enough mitigation, adaptation is impossible. But so climate resilience is a phrase that we were using, and in the course of thinking how do we center equity, we asked ourselves, what would a climate resilience agenda need to include for it to be socially just? And we didn't presume to know the answer to that question. So we interviewed people who worked on climate change and environment with an equity orientation. We commissioned background papers, and we hosted a workshop on that topic with leaders active on climate justice. That input informed the revision of our strategy. And in fact, in preparing for this, I read one of the documents that had come out of it back in either late 2013 or early 2014, and it's held up pretty well over time, and would be happy to share that with you all. So what did we learn through that exploration and our subsequent work? I chose to highlight 5 key lessons. The first of which is that we need to approach urban climate resilience work with a recognition of the legacy of institutional and structural racism. As one example that Dana actually touched upon, there's research showing clear correlations between neighborhoods that were subject to redlining and more severe climate impacts. In particular, recent research has shown about urban heat island effect and flooding. So as we think about working on climate resilience in urban areas, we need to remember that not all communities start in the same place. Not all start with the same level of safety or disadvantage. And that climate resilience work should seek to remedy past inequities. A second realization, and again, it's not really surprising, but it's worth saying out loud, that climate change planning and policies to date have included insufficient attention and insufficient analysis of the differential needs and interests of low-income communities and communities of color. Universal climate resilience goals will not be met without targeted strategies to address the unique circumstances of low-income communities and vulnerable individuals. Failing to examine the equity implications of proposed policies and actions may worsen and will certainly not rectify inequity. A third finding was a little bit like Dana. I think you were saying a change in the way we work. I'm phrasing that as a shift in our culture that's required to work with equity really fully involved. What we've observed, and including me personally, who comes from a long career working on the environment, is that we need to move beyond a strictly technical analysis of the problem and approach the work in a way that recognizes how people live their lives, recognize the holistic way in which people experience their lives and what's going on in their communities. We have found that we need to broaden our concept of what constitutes climate change work. We need to recognize that for many people, they're thinking about climate change not just in terms of climate impacts or greenhouse gas emissions, but in terms of their exposure to air pollution or their lack of access to transit, the gentrification their neighborhoods are experiencing, or their economic opportunity or lack thereof. All of those become part of climate change for a lot of the communities we work with. And a fourth finding, which again relates, I think, to Dana's new ways of working, achieving equity in climate work requires different leadership than has often been associated with climate advocacy. To truly center equity in the work, we need to support individuals and organizations that have a strong grounding in the experiences and interests and desires of people of color and people living in low-income communities. We need to respect the expertise of people in the communities in which we're working. Their knowledge of their communities' experiences and interests and desires are as legitimate or even more so than the experts that come in to work with them. And then I believe this quite strongly, that those of us who are white need to do our own racial justice work. If we say that we're working on climate resilience with equity in mind, we need to be willing to examine our own implicit bias, our own privilege, and we really need to be examining the role that race continues to play in our society. And then finally, the obvious lesson is that the scale of the climate mitigation and adaptation challenge is just enormous. I continue to be humbled by the magnitude of the problem, even as we see good and promising efforts underway in lots of localities, lots of places around the country. We only need to look at the recent wildfires and the recent hurricanes to understand the magnitude of the challenge that we're up against. And I think that is another reason why embracing equity and embracing how a more diverse section of the population is thinking about climate change helps us build a stronger movement. The final thing I'll share in closing is some of the shifts in grant-making strategies at Kresge as a result of us centering equity in the work. We've chosen to emphasize the leadership of urban and equity-focused organizations that are active in climate mitigation and adaptation work. Our shorthand is to say that we decided with at least part of our work in 2014 to flip the frame of who would receive support. This little light bulb went off and we thought, rather than trying to support majority white-led organizations who are trying to get better on equity, what if we were to fund groups that were already great in how they think about equity and help them build their capacity to work on climate change? And that was what we began to do. We still fund some white-led organizations, but increasingly are going to groups and individuals whose core competency is around equity. Secondly, we're investing in a lot of networks. Similar to JPB, we're investing in networks of nonprofit leaders that are working on climate with an equity lens, helping them connect across different different cities, and also helping to foster connections between groups that are working locally and those that are working nationally. Third, we're helping the organizations that we support build their core strengths and capacities, help them gain access to training and technical assistance that will strengthen their collective work. And then finally, we are making some selective investments in that help largely white-led organizations build their competencies and commitment to equity in their programmatic work. So with that, I'll close. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Lois. That was really a great summary of your approach and learnings over time. We really appreciate that perspective, and I think we have a lot of questions emerging in the chat, and I think we'll be able to have some good, robust conversation. I want to move to Laura now, if you're ready, and hear from you. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Dominique, for the invitation. As you could see, I have Spanish and French names, family names, and my accent is the same. It's a mixture of both.
Laura, it's hard to hear you a little bit. I don't know if you have a speaker available.
How about if I get closer and speak loud? Works better? Okay. Then let me share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Yes? Okay. Okay. So I would like first to introduce the foundation I work for. The foundation works to honor the legacy of its founder, Don Gonzalo, as we call him in Spanish, who considered that the best way to alleviate poverty and social needs was to invest in solutions that mitigates the barriers created by addiction, health, and water problems. Gonzalo Río Arronte was a recognized entrepreneur who began his professional life at the age of 17, selling candies in front of the cinema of his hometown, Puebla, and later developed one of the most successful companies in the national confectionery industry. Gonzalo is remembered for his industriousness and simplicity, a dynamic businessman with a deep and vast philanthropic vocation. In 1993, Gonzalo decided, through an open public will, to bequeath his entire patrimony to the Mexican people by creating a foundation focused on the three issues that he considered as a priority to produce the greatest impact in providing new opportunities for the most vulnerable social groups, living a productive life, free of addictions, having access to cutting-edge hospitals technology, and improving access and caring for the water. The foundation was founded in 2000. We are based in Mexico City, and the scope covers the entire country. The foundation has a remarkable financial and institutional robustness and independence, which allows us to focus on the three key issues and act genuinely for the service of the common good. We have one of the most recognized board of trustees in Mexico, whose leadership and collegiate body safeguards the philanthropic objective and makes decisions based on the consensus of the trustees. No one can take one decision in the foundation without the agreement of the other trustees. The operational team follows procedures certified by ISO 9001, and we are subject to strict internal and external audits, which guarantees the rigor of our work. With the support of external experts and promoting capacity building from the local level, we seek to consolidate efficient networks and partnerships between public and private institutions in which non-profit civil society is considered as a key actor with capacities and skills in providing solutions for those most in need. The Foundation is a benchmark in the selection of projects. We share and promote best practice in order to make visible and encourage the replication of the most successful solutions. About $22 million are invested every year in health, addictions, and water program. The water program seeks to allocate resources to convene, coordinate, and strengthen relevant actors in the water sector in Mexico through an agenda of projects and initiatives that address priority issues, generating a measurable impact on social benefits and supporting the dissemination of knowledge, promotion of good practices, and changes in public policies. We like to see ourselves, or we pretend to be acting as a orchestrating agent in the ecosystem of the water sector in Mexico. The program has been based on a comprehensive vision that takes into account all the stages of the water management cycles. It seeks to promote a holistic and multi-sectoral strategy for the management and care of water, which encourages the joint responsibility of both institutions in charge of water management and its users. Social participation, equity, transparency, and accountability are most important values. Since 2000, the water program has financed almost 300 projects, investing about $100 million so far, always requiring 50% of counterpart fund, which can be in-kind counterpart in the case of some projects, especially the small ones that are implemented in communities. The water area promotes projects through two modalities. We have one annual call for proposals, which is disseminated among potentially interested civil society organizations, public and academic organizations. And besides, our water technical board develops terms of reference for projects of its particular interest, and then we look for strategic allies for their implementation. Here you can see on the screen the three main components, with the first, which is a transversal component of our strategic plan 2019-2024. And let me briefly introduce each of them. The objective of our first component is to support comprehensive projects for access to water, sewage, and community managed water services in marginalized communities, scaling the impact through alliance and developing capacities of the executing organization and the beneficiaries of this project. The most common projects consist on promoting and installing decentralized technological systems for access to clean water and sanitation, such as rainwater catchment and storage, toilets, biofilters, and this kind of technologies. Our second component aims at supporting watershed initiatives that generate knowledge and strengthen governments, as well as governability, instruments, and processes to conserve and value hydrological ecosystem services. We particularly seek to promote financial mechanisms, governance at the local and regional level, and conservation and restoration of riverbeds, soil, water bodies, and aquifer. For these two first objectives, most of the projects that we support are received through our call for proposal, and we are currently supporting 55 projects of different size, duration, and focus. Our third component seeks to promote innovative projects of national scope that improve the management of the water by user, with a grade that this user that has a particularly great impact on water stress, water quality, and sewage. We are looking to promote the efficiency in the use of water resources in quantity, but also in quality, as well as to disseminate and promote good practices. Our principal targets right now in these components are the public water services. Sometimes there are also private services, but the institutions or companies that provide water services to cities in charge of drinking water supply and sanitation. Since 8 years, the foundation discerns annually a prize, which goes with a monetary incentive, to the urban water services that demonstrate the best performance in terms of transparency and commercial efficiency. And finally, our transversal priority components consist on supporting initiatives that promote and improve the measurement of water quality supplied for human consumption, and also the treated residual water that is discharged in the environment. And for all these projects, and besides projects that one specific project that we are currently developing that focus on information that is provided to citizens on water quality, we also require from all the projects that we receive from call of proposals to have one component of water quality monitoring. It's now compulsory for all our projects to have this component. Will help promoting this. It's not really a topic, but the other side of the coin of quantity. That since quantity and access to water is such a big problem in Mexico, so people tend to focus on quantity because 9 million of Mexicans and we forget quality. So for a foundation that also focuses on health, we think that there's the area for to shed light on water quality as well. I would like to briefly introduce two of the projects that we are currently funding. The first one that focuses on urban wastewater, green infrastructure, and climate resilience is a project implemented by the Sonoran Institute, whose director, Francisco Zamora, is actually here participating on this symposium. That's the story of this treatment wetland Las Arenitas is very interesting. In 2007, to help deal with wastewater from growing metropolitan regions, the Mexicali State Water Authority built the wastewater called Las Arenitas, the wastewater treatment plant called Las Arenitas. Soon after it began operation, however, it was apparent that the plant was already over capacity. So wastewater that was not treated up to standards suitable for human contact floated into the Hardy River, a tributary of the Colorado River that is popular for hunting, for fishing, for boating, and for swimming. Owners of home and vacation camps along the river objected not only for the smell, but also for the risk for their health, their property values, and the tourism and recreation business. The Sonoran Institute saw both a solution and an opportunity. A wetland was created next to the treatment plant that would provide additional treatment capacity, while also enhancing the river system and the local economy. The idea that was the wetland would act as a biofilter, removing sediments and pollution from the partially treated wastewater. This wetland that you can see on the screen is helping the State Water Authority and the city of Mexicali to meet water quality standards at a lower cost and than expanding the plant itself, and that improved condition of the Hardy River is boosting property values and tourism. In 2019, the first count of birds in the area yielded about 8 species and fewer than 100 total birds. 6 years later, 160 different bird species were present, and with a maximum bird count of 18,000 birds in only 6 years. The changes in perspective from the water agency is so far the greatest success, especially in this desertic area severely impacted by water scarcity and climate change. Before this project, it was not conceivable that an agency would invest so much in an environmental project in raising habitat, restoring wetland. And now they are very excited about Las Arenitas and we are excited too. We have recently, 1 year ago, started funding this project in a second phase. And thanks to the Río Arronte Foundation, the funds, the Sonoran Institute, in close collaboration with state and city authorities, is building a second wetland, which will allow to allocate a greater amount of water for environmental purposes, and also will involve the Kukapa people, indigenous group that resides in this area. You can see on the slide the main indicators that we will use as a foundation to measure the impact and success of this project.
Laura, I just want to note that we need a little time for discussion at the end, so
sorry.
wrap up. Thanks so much. Yeah.
Okay, I will go very quickly on this on this second project, which is also in the northern part of Mexico. So this through this program, which is called Watersheds Cities, we support the development of an institutional coordination process that make possible the improvement of watershed management and establishment of pilot models for the conservation of these watersheds. These require informed participation from different sectors and the promotion of co-responsibility among urban and the rural users who receive benefits from environmental service. So the organization in charge of this program, the Mexican Fund for Nature Conservation, provide technical and financial assistance for building local capacities and institutional arrangements that favor the implementation of long-term initiatives that do not depend on political changes. So the best success indicator for us is a growing flow of investment and significant participation of social and governmental actors. So in the case of this program, which has 15 projects inside of it, the Mexican Fund established an alliance with a civil social organization that act as a local partner. And this organization has to assume the leadership to improve planning, investment of resources, and interinstitutional collaboration. So the one of these 15 projects is the one you can see on the screen. It's in Saltillo, the city of Saltillo. You can see the mountains on the back, which is the main upper part of the watershed. And in this case, this project has the greatest record of voluntary contribution in the entire country, which has also been possible thanks to the excellent work of Aguas de Saltillo, which is the water service provider, which is a private company that has developed a very successful public-private partnership. So when we have urban users that are happy with their water services, they are much more keen on understanding and financing the conservation and restoration actions that has to be done in the upper watershed. And finally, about challenges and opportunities, and I have heard that we coincide, although each foundation is different, we coincide, I think, in many of our learnings and opportunities. We are very conscious that it's important to, we are very conscious that we are a reference and authoritative voice, but we have to use the foundation prestige to increase the social impact. As a foundation that has a very low profile in terms of communications, we are at the same time sensitive about the fact that we have to communicate more, and at the same time keep this low profile, also give many benefits. We also...
Let me just stop you right there. So we have a couple minutes for questions, and we can go over a couple of minutes, but it's fantastic. Thank you so much. Your presentation is really wonderful, and I learned about 200% more about
sorry for taking such a long time learning. Reading is a bit longer. Sorry for that.
No, that's fine. It's wonderful. Thank you. I wanted to ask just one question quickly of the panel. If we may have time for a couple of questions from the group before we move on to our next piece. I don't know if Secretary Salazar has rejoined or not, so we'll go for that. The question I wanted to ask, there are so many questions. I'd love to ask where and whether you see work overlapping. I know that Kresge and JPB work together, but what is the role of philanthropic funding relative to other funding? And what is it you can do with philanthropic funding? And Laura, I know you and I talked about how sometimes your funding is the only thing that ensures water quality testing is happening in a apples to apples sort of standard way. And I am just curious to know from the panelists if you have thoughts about that. Is it risk capital? Is it innovation funding? How do you think about it?
Such a great question. I think about it along a continuum. Not that JPB does everything it could do with our philanthropic capital, but speaking more generally, it's a wonderful tool. You know, it can provide funding for things that just otherwise wouldn't be resourced. It can also hold projects to some kind of outcome that the community really wants to see. So it has oftentimes, you know, some metrics associated with how the funds are spent. But then it can also do a whole bunch of other things. It can really help to innovate, to allow communities to think more freely about the possibilities. But ultimately, you know, our philanthropic dollars are so small compared to what we have to do as a country and as a planet. And so, you know, I think understanding who's going to take out philanthropy if something is successful. Oftentimes we engage, you heard me reference a few pilots or efforts that are in cities that absolutely depend on the public sector. And I think we could do a whole lot more to engage the private sector. So I'm not sure that I totally answered your question, but it can do all the things you said. And it's a matter of remembering that and to use it in those flexible ways.
That's great. Lois, did you want to add anything?
Well, I would just add that with our social investment capital, we're able to leverage private sector money. So our social investment practice provides loans and loan guarantees to projects that can't afford private capital interest rates. And I was just on a presentation today, and our social investment practice over the past 10 years has leveraged something like $1.2 billion in other capital with $350 million of investment. So there's our grant money can have a play, but our
That's wonderful. I know when I was doing grant making, often coming together facilitated collaboration in a way that might not have always happened. That's not always a welcome request, but it's great when it makes sense. And Laura, I saw you in the chat, innovation. Is that you're thinking of the best leverage point?
Yeah, I think so. And being the locomotive of a long train that, of course, we cannot feel all the things that should be on that train and on the money that is needed, but we definitely can be the locomotive of new passes and projects and problems that has always been there, but that the governments always struggle to tackle in the long term with a long-term vision.
Great. Another question I've seen and heard is, how do you know if you're succeeding? And this, I know it's a perennial question. How do you measure outcomes? How do you know whether to stay the course or to change course? How do you decide?
Well, I would say that for me, the best measure is when I visit the projects and I see beneficiaries that has changed their life. This woman that don't need to carry water anymore. And for me, it's the best measure of success. And indeed, it's very challenging, and it's difficult to keep giving the importance that has to be given to all the human aspects and components of one project, and at the same time trying to put them in an equation where you have quantity, or you have a return of investment and some numbers that really makes some sense. So I think it's an area where philanthropy still have to innovate a lot. What's the good way of measuring our efforts without going in any of the extreme that we tend to go.
That makes sense. Yeah. Lois and Dana, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I agree with what Laura said, and I think it's difficult. I think some of it is if if you obtain a policy victory, if you see a stronger public attention on an issue that was neglected before. I think there's a lot of qualitative measures, not so many quantitative ones.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay. I know, Dana, at one point you said that when you're supporting policy ideas, that if policy's successful, I mean, the ideal outcome is you don't need to fund things because they become fully integrated. Have you seen that happen?
Yeah, definitely. And that is one measure of success. We had oftentimes when you can invest in people, building relationships and organizing on the ground for, part of your grant funding, that gets leveraged X amount when they're successful and the local or national government is able to make that a policy and allocate the budget resources towards it. We have an effort called Energy Efficiency for All. We've invested in helping utilities understand what it might mean to recognize energy efficiency in rental housing that's affordable to people with really low incomes. And what we've done is basically unlock hundreds of millions of dollars of utility ratepayer program dollars to get invested back in those properties. So that, is one measure of success when you see your grant dollars result in the public or private sector then taking that on at a scale we never ever could. It would be the only thing we did. But it really depends how you define success, and ultimately, we want to make sure that the people in the communities where we're targeting our resources really benefit. Right. And also, as I said earlier, just building relationships, when those relationships get formed, it's invaluable, and being able to measure that's really difficult, as Lois said, but it has benefits that you really can't even get your arm around sometimes, because those success measures show up in ways that you can't always track, but it's happening.
Wonderful. With that, is there any final comments any of you would like to make? After we're ready, I'll hand it over to Secretary Salazar. Any final thoughts?
This is Sonrisa. Be happy to ask a question if that's all right.
I'm sorry, what?
This is Sonrisa. I was saying I'd love to ask a question if that's okay.
Sonrisa, I think we're going to move forward, but so why don't you ask one quick question and then we'll keep going. That sounds good.
Okay, I applaud the efforts of our foundations here, being able to move forward with the strategies of supporting organizations of color or that are led by people of color. Usually those are the ones most equipped to respond with targeted universalism. But I'm also curious on how that conversation is going two ways, and how you're able to bring in the voices of those organizations to transform the agenda of the foundations, and how your funding strategies are developed going forward. Because oftentimes organizations are having to shift their work to ever chase the dollar, rather than the organizations kind of following the lead of the foundations following the lead of the organizations.
Great.
Well, it's such a good question, Lois. I feel like you should take that because you're so advanced. I'm happy to say a few words, but I mean, it's such a good question because that's exactly what is happening. I would say, I'll speak for JPB. The more that we invest in Indigenous and Black and people of color led organizations, like I said, the important secret sauce is building these relationships, and we really want trust-based relationships, and that means giving and taking. And you know, we haven't figured it all out, but we're open and we're trying to understand different vehicles. As Beth asked, you know, our grant making can happen in so many different ways. Sometimes we get locked into doing it a certain way for a long time, and we think that's all we can do. But I think the most exciting thing happening in philanthropy is that we're beginning to listen to those leaders of color and changing our practices. And Lois, I think you're doing some of the best work out there.
Thank you. Well, I think when we designed our strategy shift in 2014, we did have a lot of input from outsiders, and I think we're trying to be in good communication with them. But it's a perennial problem in foundations. It's very difficult to have that true relationship where over time we're taking direction from people on the field. It's not the history of philanthropy, and there's still.
Wonderful. All right. Well, with that, let me reintroduce Ken Salazar, and thank you to our panel. Actually, let me pause there and pull a Ken Salazar and have everyone unmute and applaud. Thank you so much. It was fabulous to hear from you.